I was going to start by saying it's a pleasure to be here, but I have to qualify that now that I've heard the menu for the day. just slightly qualify it. Well, to begin at the beginning, we don't actually know Adam Smith's birth date, only his baptism date, which is recorded as the 5th of June, 1723. Translated from the old-style Julian calendar of that time in Britain into our calendar is the 16th of June, 1723. And in fact, the Sydney presentation of this talk I'm giving now was given on that date about 10 days ago. The presumption is that his birth date is close to this, possibly very close, because baptism expeditiously followed birth in those times due to high infant mortality combined with belief in hell. Let me now turn to more substantive matters. The birth that really matters here for us today, and one of the two principal reasons for marking this tercentenary, is the birth of economic science itself in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. Smith is often characterised as the founder of economics, or political economy as it was then called, which is certainly an overstatement. But just as certainly, he was a pivotal figure in the formation of the discipline and in bringing it to a certain level of maturity. The second principal reason for marking this tercentenary, which Alan also commented on, is that Smith is also a key figure in the intellectual history of liberalism. The intertwining of these two distinct dimensions of the retrospective image of Smith is itself symptomatic of the proneness of social science in general to ideological influence. As a consequence, some of the retrospective perceptions of Smith are mere distortions and parodies created in the service of latter-day ideological purposes and conflicts. And against this, I hope to recover, at least in some degree, the genuine thought and voice of the historical Adam Smith. Well, first, a few biographical facts just to sketch out the life. As Alan also mentioned, Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, to a moderately well-off family, although his father died 5 months before he was born. At the age of 14, he attended the University of Glasgow, and then from 1740, by way of scholarship, Balliol College, Oxford, for 6 years. Smith studied philosophy and European literature. Following then some years freelance lecturing in Edinburgh, primarily on rhetoric and belles lettres. Belles lettres is a university discipline which has disappeared. It was essentially the study of literary aesthetics. Also lectured on the history of philosophy and jurisprudence. Then in 1751, he was appointed Professor of Logic at Glasgow. The following year, he shifted to the chair of moral philosophy. And then in 1764, aged merely 40, he resigned his professorship to take up the position of travelling tutor to a young Scottish aristocrat, the Duke of Buccleuch. That was the end of his university career. As a consequence as well from this job of tutoring the young Scottish aristocrat, he acquired a life pension from the family of £300 per annum. In that tutoring role, Smith then spent nearly 3 years in France. There, partly via the assistance of his friend David Hume, he met a wide range of intellectuals, including Voltaire in Geneva, and importantly for Smith's economic thought, Francois Canet, the leading figure of the French physiocratic school, as well as Henri Jacques Turgot. After returning from France in late 1766, Smith exploited the financial independence provided by his pension to spend 6 years in Kirkcaldy drafting and redrafting The Wealth of Nations, hereafter WN. The last 3 years prior to its publication was spent in London, partly to facilitate completion of empirical aspects of the book. During this period, he was also made a Fellow of the Royal Society. The Wealth of Nations was published on 9th of March 1776, the same year as the death of his closest intellectual friend, Hume, and of course the year of the American Declaration of Independence. The latter political conflict figures a little in the book. In 1778, Smith also wrote a memorandum on the Anglo-American conflict for Alexander Wedderburn, who was British Prime Minister Lord North's Solicitor General. In February 1778, Smith was appointed a Commissioner of Customs in Edinburgh, a post he held until 1790, which is the year he died, adding a salary of £600 to his private per annum, to his private pension of £300 per annum. The apparent irony of the political economist who so vigorously and systematically railed against European policies of trade restriction in the wealth of nations, entering into the governance of part of that system, has been a source of amusement or bemusement, although I think a clearer understanding of Smith's policy views much diminishes the paradox, and I'm going to come back to this issue a bit later. He also, in these latter years, provided advice to the British policymakers on removal of restrictions on Anglo-Irish trade and the consequences of the loss of the North American colonies. In the last decade of his life, he undertook as well significant revisions of WN, and even more so of his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Smith died from a chronic bowel obstruction in Edinburgh on 17 July 1790. According to one account, his last words to his friends were, "I believe we must adjourn this meeting to some other place." It is the case that the character and personality of the man remains rather opaque to us. In his Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry on Smith, Donald Winch, in seeking to sum him up, notes the elusiveness, even reclusiveness, of his character, partly due to the slight extant correspondence and an absence of autobiographical reflections. One can say that the most interesting things that happened to and with Smith happened between his ears. But he was not an unsociable man. While it is the case that we have limited access to the interior of the man, there are surviving anecdotes which suggest a by no means colourless character. On one occasion, when Samuel Johnson, the founder of the Oxford English Dictionary, apparently made a disparaging comment about Smith's friend, the somewhat notorious David Hume, Smith is said to have turned on Johnson and called him a son of a bitch. According to a further anecdote, on another occasion, over supper with a small group, in 1789, Smith was moved to loudly defend one of his intellectual heroes, Voltaire. The talk then turned to French writers, in particular Voltaire and Turgot. It was on this occasion that Smith would not hear of some clever but superficial author being called by Samuel Rogers a Voltaire. Smith banged the table and declared energetically, "Sir, there is only one Voltaire." Regarding Turgot, he was described to Rogers by Smith as an excellent, absolutely honest and well-intended person who was not well versed in human nature, with all its selfishness, stupidity and prejudice. Turgot had been for a short time finance minister of France and had the temerity to try to implement some reforms of the French economy, and of course, as a result, lost his job. And I think these comments on Turgot are probably an allusion to those events. Let me now turn to Smith's writings and just sketch the broad character of the body of work that he left behind. because it's a far larger and far more expansive than just the Wealth of Nations. The corpus of extant Smith writings is actually quite modest, partly explained by his making a considered decision to have most of his unpublished manuscripts destroyed upon his death. 16 volumes of manuscripts being consigned to the flames during his last days. A sin against intellectual history, destroying one's archive like that. For scholars like me, I mean, not for Adam Smith. He made the right decision. The first of his two books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was published in 1759 with 5 further revised editions during Smith's lifetime. The 1796 edition in particular involving substantial additions. It was also translated into French and German quite quickly. Hence, when The Wealth of Nations appeared in 1776, it was the work of a person with already a high intellectual reputation in Europe. There were also 4 further revised editions during Smith's lifetime of the Wealth of Nations, with the 1784 third edition, in particular involving significant changes. And it also went into German and French quite quickly. Smith had most of his manuscript writings destroyed at the time of his death, but not all of them. The exceptions consist of 6 essays which were subsequently published together in 1795 under the title Essays on Philosophical Subjects. The first 3 of these essays concern the history of science, with the first of these concerning the history of astronomy, much the largest. It has figured prominently in interpretations of Smith's thought as a whole, his conception of the character and progress of astronomy being understood as implying his view of the nature of science in general. The remaining 3 essays primarily concern aesthetics. After Smith's death, we have the discovery of a series of documents which greatly enhance our understanding of his thinking. From the end of the 19th century, the corpus of extant Smith texts was importantly augmented by the discovery of 3 sets of student lecture notes, all large documents. In 1958, a set of student notes from Smith's 1762-63 lectures on rhetoric and belles-lettres were discovered. This is a highly detailed transcription of 30 lectures, averaging almost 7 pages in modern print per lecture. I should say at this point, the only way of understanding these documents is that they must have been taken down in shorthand. They are immaculate. They are written in almost entirely in perfect English and then translated into English subsequently. The character and significance of language is a central motif of these lectures, as it is, of course, of the latter essays on aesthetics. I should say that the nature and significance of language is an ongoing, continuous motif in Smith's thinking and writing throughout his life. In relation to Smith's economics, it is the further 2 sets of subsequently discovered lecture notes which are of particular interest. They are fairly parallel texts on jurisprudence. That's the title. Together amounting to over 550 pages in modern print, resulting from 2 equivalent courses of lectures given in 1762-63 and 1763-64. The latter set of notes happening to coincide with Smith's last teaching session at Glasgow before he retired from academic life at the age of 40. These documents contain quite a substantial quantity of economic analysis, enabling some comparison between the state of Smith's economic thinking at that time, in the early 1760s, and in 1776, with his years in France notably intervening between these dates. More on this later as well. Strictly speaking, of course, all three sets of lecture notes are not Smith writings, but there are considerable grounds for supposing their veracity. I want to add one final reflection on the scale, before I turn to the economics. I want to add one final reflection on the scale of Smith's intellectual ambition. In a prefatory note to the 6th edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which appeared shortly before his death in 1790, Smith draws attention to a promise he had made in the last paragraph of the book, in all 5 previous editions, to publish, quote, an account of the general principles of law and government and of the different revolutions which they had undergone in the different on earth is that? Okay, this is where I should be. Smith draws attention to a promise he had made in the last paragraph of the book in all 5 previous editions to publish an account of the general principles of law and government and of the different revolutions which they had undergone in the different ages and periods of society, covering both justice or jurisprudence and political economy. The wealth of nations had fulfilled the latter part of that promise, but Smith admits to little hope now of completing the former. The lecture notes on jurisprudence give us some idea of what such a work might have looked like. Smith also writes in a letter of 1785, I have 2 other great works upon the anvil. The one is a sort of philosophical history of all the different branches of literature, of philosophy, poetry, and eloquence. The other is a sort of theory and history of law and government. Elements of all this are preserved in essays on philosophical subjects and in the lecture notes on rhetoric and belles lettres and on jurisprudence. In the same letter, Smith admits the unlikelihood of these plans being brought to completion. Here is the point I want to make. In this wide-ranging, even comprehensive ambition, one sees Smith's vision for achieving that unified social science to which the 18th century aspired. Indeed, a good part of the fascination in recent decades with the whole corpus of Smith's writings and their interrelations is perhaps due to our seeing in the comprehensiveness of Smith's treatment of the human condition something latter-day social science has lost as a result of disciplinary and subdisciplinary specialisation. There is an irony here, since Smith is famous for his division of labour doctrine and himself explicitly applies this principle, facilitating labour productivity growth, also to science, not just to production in the ordinary sense. The irony is compounded by the fact that his own intellectual labours did not prove productive enough to succeed in achieving a projected outcome, the pursuit of which amounted to a refusal himself to acquiesce in intellectual specialisation. Let me turn now to the political economy. As you will have seen from the program, I have been given 2 slots today. The two papers were not designed initially for one audience, and so there is a little bit of intersection. So on the invisible hand, of course, which is what the theme, the more focused theme of that second presentation this afternoon is. So I'm going to jump a little bit in this political economy, so it'll be a bit shorter than it should be for proper balance. so as not to duplicate and to save time for question and answer time in this session. So, turning to the political economy, it is commonly suggested that Smith's most notable achievement in The Wealth of Nations was to demonstrate that commodity demands and supplies can be coordinated spontaneously, so to speak, by way of competition acting through price flexibility in a decentralised economy. This being in turn identified with his invisible hand doctrine. Against this common view, it is a striking fact that Smith prefaces the book, The Wealth of Nations, with an introduction and plan of the work, a summary statement of a little over 1,000 words, Smith's version of an executive summary, that does not even once refer to markets or prices. That is astonishing. Not even once does he refer to markets or prices in that over 1,000 word summary of what he claims the book to be about. The central theme of the book is rather the conditions and causes of economic development understood as economic growth with qualitative or structural change involving rising output per worker and rising living standards, consumption per capita, extending to the mass of society's members. That is what the book is about, in my view, in one overly long sentence. The wealth referred to in the title is the flow of annual national product, with Smith's focus the dynamics of the national product over time, interrelated with the distribution of aggregate income, particularly between wages and profits, and the allocation of the national product between consumption and capital accumulation. The proximate causes of economic growth or development are capital accumulation, with human capital explicitly included, and increasing division of labour specialisation. These two factors in turn are derivative from underlying propensities of human nature, of which the desire of bettering our condition is the most important. The division of labour doctrine, second only to the invisible hand as the doctrine most famously associated with Smith, is enunciated in the opening chapters of the book. Labour specialisation, the source of labour productivity growth, is limited or enabled by the extent of the market. It is a concept of ongoing technical change in a growing economy. Well, let me go to the question of capital, and then I will jump across the invisible hand to the question of policy. With respect to the theory of growth with structural change, capital and the accumulation of capital are the necessary prerequisite for ongoing expansion of division of labour and the associated technical progress or innovation. Capital is also central to Smith's theory of commodity prices and the functional distribution of income between wages, profits and rents. The price theory is built around the concept of natural prices, cost plus prices incorporating normal rates of return to capital, labour and land. The natural price of a commodity is the analogue in Smith's thought of what we would call the long-run equilibrium supply price. When actual market prices deviate from natural prices due to supply-demand imbalances, it is the mobility of capital between different activities which is the key expression of competition, acting to return actual prices to equality with natural or equilibrium prices and restore supply-demand balance. In another aspect, the pressure of competition also induces innovation. there is a question as to how original Smith's economics is. I leave that question aside except to highlight one crucial intellectual debt. I mentioned earlier the 1760 Smith lecture notes, which enable comparison between his economic thinking at that time and in The Wealth of Nations 15 or so years later. And I noted that his years in France intervened between those dates. In contrast to the centrality of capital in WN, Smith's economics of the 1760s contains virtually no reference to any role for capital. If one were to attempt the thought experiment of removing capital theory from the Wealth of Nations to see what would be left, in truth, one would be left with rubble. As I've indicated, the role of capital is vital to the economics of WN. The mobility of capital in search of the highest possible returns is the systematic force governing the formation of prices and functional income distribution, a dynamic already made clear by Turgot. And the accumulation of capital, along with technical progress, is the driver of economic development and economic growth, a theory developed, at least in a primitive way, by Francois Quesnay. Well, this is where I jump across the invisible hand. And turn to Smith's policy views. Oh, thanks for that. I don't know why computers hate me so much. I've done nothing to them. So, can someone tell me where the rest of the slides are? There are 31 slides, and that's number 20.
Pause the video. Hang on a second. Okay. Good thing you don't have to 10 minutes, sorry. Nothing can go wrong. I'm just trying to say maybe they put it into the next bit. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if it's in the next bit.
I don't trust anybody. I've got a plug there that has the file if you want.
No. Sorry, I don't know why it's not there. Tony, you can probably just keep on talking and then don't worry about the slides.
You want me to get my...
No, just keep on talking. Slides don't.
Sure?
Yeah, slides won't matter. Just leave it there.
Okay. The slides are not for my benefit. And some of these quotes are quite elaborate, and I think it's most useful for people to be able to see them. But can I also say that at the Sydney presentation, the written document, I have a written document here which has precise citations in it as well. And that document was provided to every registrant at the end of the session by email. So that would be useful if that could happen here as well. As to Smith's policy views, one could say, fundamentally, his policy is liberal capitalism. And beyond that, no policy, so to speak. But this would be a considerable overstatement. It is certainly his view that liberal capitalism, acting through human nature, expressed in particular in individuals' desire for material self-betterment, and within a properly constituted framework of law, securing life, liberty, and property rights, will suffice to deliver prosperity that will flow down to all. That liberal temper is nicely captured in his prescriptive definition of political economy. This would have been useful for you to see, but let me try to handle it orally. Quote, political economy, considered as a branch of the science of a statesman or legislator proposes two distinct objects. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services. It proposes to enrich both the people and the sovereign." Unquote. Notice the two asymmetries here. In relation to the people versus the state, plenty for the former, but just sufficiency for the latter. And rather than providing for the people, enabling them to provide for themselves, whereas the state is implicitly treated as unable to so self-provide. To put the latter point bluntly, for Smith, private sector economic activity produces and consumes, and capital accumulation is an expression of production exceeding consumption, whereas public sector activity just consumes. But this is an overstatement even of Smith's view. He allows that the state undertakes some productive activity. And of course, he also fully understands that the political and legal infrastructure of the state for the protection of life, liberty and property is an essential precondition for private economic activity. More broadly, there are two important caveats to Smith's economic liberalism. First, Smith explicitly allows for a considerable number of exceptions to strict economic liberalism in WN, including sumptuary laws, restriction of paper money and credit, product quality validation, legal prohibition of wage payments in kind rather than money, laws obliging private owners to cultivate their land at pain of forfeiture. So much for the sacredness of property. At the pain of forfeiture. Infant industry protection, preventative public health policies, and allowance that government can successfully run commercial enterprise. Postal services being Smith's favourite example. No privatisation of the post for Adam Smith. Smith even makes some mild recommendations in favour of progressive taxation. And in the final book 5, which Alan also referenced, he examines the three legitimate roles or duties of government in enforcement of justice, external defence and public works. The latter, the public works in particular, involving transport infrastructure and education. Second, there is in Adam Smith a deep and pervasive moderateness and caution concerning the implementation of theory in practice. And in this respect, he is far from being a laissez-faire ideological zealot. A good example of this moderateness is his advocacy for abolishing Britain's monopoly of the American colony trade, but only gradually. In short, Smith is not a shock therapy kind of a guy. This aspect of the man also points to why his serving as Commissioner of Customs, earlier mentioned, is not really paradoxical or hypocritical. In text added only to the 6th edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the last edition he undertook, Smith made a long and substantial passage of argument explicitly attacking a character type he calls the man of system. This is a big quote, which again would be good for you to be able to see backwards and forwards. Quote, this is his description of the man of system. Quote, "Wise in his own conceit, often so enamoured with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government, that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interests or the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. Some general, even systematical idea of the perfection of policy and law may no doubt be necessary for directing the views of the statesman, but to insist upon establishing all at once and in spite of all opposition, everything which that idea may seem to require must often be the highest degree of arrogance." Unquote. This moderateness concerning policy implementation of theory is bolstered by a certain confidence that human nature will still be working away for the good, even under defective policy regimes. This is also an extensive quote. This is a friendly criticism of his friend Canet. Smith characterises Canet as saying, either we have perfect free trade or we're going to have complete disaster, as if these are the two only possible states of the world. And Smith criticises him in a friendly way here, because Canet was a physician. In fact, he was the physician to Louis XIV's mistress. So he says to Canet, I'm just giving you the context and then I'll read the smaller part of the text. He says, you know, the human body, you know, people with not such good diets, but they still function pretty well. You know, they don't have a perfect diet, but you know, they still carry on pretty well. So then he goes on. In the political body, the natural effort which every man is continually making to better his own condition is a principle of preservation, capable of preventing and correcting, in many respects, the bad effects of a political economy in some degree, both partial and oppressive. So here political economy is being used in the sense of policy regime, yeah? So this is the diet, right? So the diet's not so good, but things can still go okay. Such a political economy, though it no doubt retards more or less, is not always capable of stopping altogether the natural progress of a nation towards wealth and prosperity, and still less of making it go backwards. If a nation could not prosper without the enjoyment of perfect liberty and perfect justice, there is not in the world a nation which could ever have prospered. Unquote. It would have been good at this point for me to address the question of the relation, or at least some of the relations, between Smith's economics and his wider thought. Given the time constraint, I have been compelled to sacrifice this aspect. Probably the most important and enduring question in relation to this issue is the consistency or otherwise between the moral philosophy of the theory of moral sentiments and the economics of the wealth of nations. I think they are consistent. For Smith, in the theory of moral sentiments, an adequate account of human society must be able to account for the evident fact that the human being is a self-regarding animal at the same time as it is an intrinsically social and sociable being. In a way, the theory of moral sentiments in our language is more an exercise in social psychology. How is it? What is it in the human being that enables selfishness to be reconciled with sociability? This is the problematic is an empirical one, if you like, not so much a normative one, but although it's got normative content as well, of course. To this slight comment, I only add that Smith's definition of political economy, quoted earlier, presents it as a branch of a larger science, and that larger science is characterised as a science for the legislator, making clear that it is emphatically a policy science. I also earlier pointed to Smith's remarkably large intellectual ambition as pointing to the aspiration for a unified social science. This 18th century thing, I think you can see this also in the prefatory quote that I used from William Robertson, the epigraph. See, Robertson, when he writes to Smith about the book, which he's had for a month, Robertson's had the book for a month, he calls it part of political science, yeah? This is not just Adam Smith's view, I think. Okay, so the final thing that I want to do is to say something about Adam Smith and our problems today. For my part, the overall character, orientation and scope of Smith's economics are very attractive as a model for doing economics. This goes in particular to its aim to explain the dynamics of the economic system as a whole, with the substantive content focused on functional income distribution, economic growth and structural change, and with a strong historical consciousness, open to the role of the contingencies of specific histories of peoples in shaping economic evolution, and to the interplay of socio-political and economic forces, a kind of institutionalist temper, one could say. When Thomas Piketty's 2014 book had the good fortune to be the book in the right place at the right time, I noted in a review essay that if one were to suggest an appropriate epigraph for the book, a worthy candidate would be the title of Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. Quote, of the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labour and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people, unquote. Piketty's book revived the great macro-historical issues of classical economics, in particular, the long-run dynamics of growth, distribution, and the interrelations between the two. Beyond that endorsement of the overall character of Smith's economics, I conclude my written text with reflections on two issues that I take to be our most crucial economic problems, but this is a normative matter, so reasonable people can disagree as to what our most pressing problems are. But the two I nominate are environmental crisis and economic inequality. On the question of environmental crisis, Adam Smith is, as always, moderate, but a moderate technology optimist. So the prospect of capitalism, liberal capitalism, delivering economic growth and distributing the benefits of growth widely to the entire population involves a kind of a contest between more binding natural scarcities, natural resource scarcities as the human economy expands, versus human ingenuity expressed in technical progress or innovation in enabling labour productivity growth. And the question is where the balance of forces between these two will lie. And I think Smith is a moderate technology optimist in thinking that rising standards of life are going to be possible in an expanding economy. But Smith was also of the view that ultimately economic societies would reach a maximum feasible scale, thereby arriving at an endpoint stationary state, a zero growth economy, perhaps even negative growth. For Smith, this appears as a distant prospect. In fact, the only example of a stationary state that he offered, China, is attributed to bad policy, not to binding natural resource constraints. But the human economy of Smith's world was relatively small in terms of the human footprint on the natural environment. It was not entirely impossible in that world for human production and consumption to exhaust natural resources or to generate waste and pollution beyond the capacity of non-human nature to absorb without damage. It was not entirely impossible, but these were possibilities that did not loom large in the overall scheme of things. That is not so for our world. In contrast to the archetypal scarce natural resource of classical economics, good quality land, with respect to that most pressing of our contemporary environmental crises, climate change. The scarce natural resource is the finite capacity of the atmosphere for absorbing greenhouse gas emissions. Smith's stationary state doctrine is a repudiation of the astonishing idea that the human economy could expand indefinitely without limit. An end would come, even if, in 1776, far off into the future. And then finally, to the second of these two problems, in my view, our most pressing problems, economic inequality. The widely distributed rising living standards that Smith expected competitive liberal capitalism to deliver is entirely consistent with rising inequality in the personal distribution of income. It's precisely innovation which gives the degree of freedom to enable rising absolute standards of living with rising inequality at the same time. Yeah? Simple. Smith's account of the dynamics of a competitive capitalist economy provides no determinate outcome with respect to the course of income inequality. It is a contingent matter. But Smith's recourse to a trickle-down defence of liberal capitalism suggests that he had a hunch that in practice income inequality would likely rise, which could be partly justified by a rising absolute standard of living that would supposedly occur for the lowest paid workers. Broadly speaking, for Smith, arresting or ameliorating any such rising income inequality would not be a legitimate objective of government, and he is against labour unions. Consistently, he's against employer unions and collusion as well. Nevertheless, there are points at which Smith opens the door at least a little to policy intervention related to distribution. I mentioned earlier his endorsing prohibition of wage payment in kind and some mild recommendations for progressive taxation. In respect to the payment of wages, here is the relevant quotation. This is from The Wealth of Nations. Whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its councillors are always the masters. When the regulation, therefore, is in favour of the workman, it is always just and equitable. But it is sometimes otherwise when in favour of the masters. Thus, the law which obliges the masters in several different trades to pay their workmen in money and not in goods is quite just and equitable. Now, here's my question of this great icon of economic liberalism. Why should not workers and employers be free to choose a labour contract for payment in kind if they wish? Smith's approach to the theory of wages in terms of the balance of bargaining power around the labour contract provides the key. Quote, "It is not difficult to foresee which of the two parties, workers and employers," that's me in square brackets, workers and employers, "must, upon all ordinary occasions, have the advantage in dispute and force the other into a compliance with their terms," unquote. So, at least with respect to the labour contract, not free to choose, but more likely a forced compliance. From that vantage point, Smith's willingness to endorse a prohibition on payment of wages in kind is evidently the expression of a willingness to constrain that balance as an imbalance of bargaining power, so as to limit the power of employers. Here he has conferred some legitimacy upon the regulation of unequal economic and political power that informs functional and personal income distribution. Well, I want to stop because I want to give time for Q&A, but I will just add one final little bit, and maybe you will have the written text to look at the detail more later. Some time ago, in a review of a book on Smith, the full details are in the written text, I noted the author's somewhat triumphalist comment in the concluding chapter, telling that the course of capitalism in relation to living standards had vindicated Adam Smith. And I commented, but the capitalism we've had over much of the 19th and 20th centuries is not exactly the capitalism recommended by Smith. There is the little matter of the rise and persistence, at least for much of that long period, of labour unionism. It is a question whether living standards would have risen as they have in the history of capitalism, in the absence of that, as well as other institutional elements pertaining to public sector activity and labour law and regulation, with which Smith might or might not have agreed. Thank you for your attention.
Tony, that was fabulous. You know, when we discussed whether we should delete some of his slides, I said, no, we'll be absolutely fine. He was over it. So we'll open it up to questions. Do we have some microphone?
I'm trying to find where they've got to.
Having just said how you must use a microphone, I'm going to find the microphone, but I'll just go.
I was told they were right there, but they're not.
Okay. While you do that, I'll take a question now, though. Yes.
Thank you, Tony, for that. Two questions on money. Questions Adam Smith's in his time, what type of money did they have? Commodity money or fiat currency? And you touched on briefly that he's looked at was a little bit of supply of money. So how would you characterise his thinking on money policy? And actually, I don't even know what the monetary system was like back then, so if you could give it back to that.
So the questions were, the first question was on the nature of the money specie, whether it was a fiat or a commodity currency, and the second question was on the question of limiting the quantity of credit and the nature of monetary policy. Is that a fair summary? Perfect. Okay. So on the first, it's a little bit tricky, right? So, I mean, the short answer would be it's a commodity currency, right? But of course, there are private banks issuing bits of paper which have liquidity. I mean, they can be exchanged, right? People are prepared to accept them as a form of payment. So you're in a sort of a bit of a... It's always there's always the old joke with the monetarists versus the Keynesians. Say, they've got 300 definitions of what money is, right? And there's a reason for that. Liquidity is a spectrum. It's not like this is liquidity and this is illiquidity. There's actually degrees of liquidity, because all liquidity means is how widely acceptable is this thing as a means of payment, right? That's what liquidity is. So I would say the short answer is a commodity currency, but with private banks issuing paper of varying quality and credibility and so on. The whole question of monetary policy is, and banking policy then, right? So banking policy and monetary policy must be closely connected. Smith is not highly regarded for his monetary analysis, fairly or otherwise. It's not an area I've taken a lot of interest in personally, so I don't want to really say too much. I facetiously said at a conference in Europe last year that Smith's attitude to banking is, if bankers behave well, all will be well. So, well, how about that? So, if bankers behave well, all will be well. Yeah, that's right. Good point. It's like he has this idea that as long as bankers vet credit issuance so as they only provide credit to genuine productive capital, there's no problem about issuing currency, right? You don't have to worry about limiting currency as long as bankers behave, right? Well, will they behave? That's the question. So you can think about it as saying, what are the institutional arrangements that might best be conducive to making bankers who issue private credit behave? Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Another question? We've got a bit of time, so jump up, fire away. Right at the back there.
How's that? Tony, I know that Adam Smith's often misquoted in by people who want to defend tariffs. And it seems to be when they analyse that the people use, by misquoting him, insert the word domestic in front of protecting industry. And when you analyse his writings, he doesn't use that word at all. So it's a little bit of a fraudulent usage. He certainly doesn't defend. He doesn't defend tariffs in his writings. But I wondered if you, in your experience, had come across that the fact that he is often misquoted for the wrong reasons. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. I'm not directly familiar right now in my head with that tariff thing. I mentioned that he provides some defence of infant industry protection, but hey, it's very marginal. I couldn't give you the detail right now, but if you email me, I will send you the relevant text. But it's clear he's not in favour of protection. Right? Let's be clear about this. But he does provide a little bit of concession on some infant industry possibilities. And of course, patents are a form of protection as well, right? Defended in terms of intellectual property. And the other thing I mentioned, which is sort of relevant to your question, your comment, is this thing about he wants to abolish the British monopoly on the colony trade before everything falls apart, right? The American colony trade. But see, there's that gradualism thing where he says, look, people, you've set up a policy regime. People have invested their capital under these rules. You can't just blow it up overnight. This is not fair, right? So there's this idea that you should dismantle this protection, but you shouldn't just blow the place up, right? So I suppose you could say this is an expression of the idea that the policymakers need to show some consistency of purpose, like capricious changes to the rules of the game are not reasonable. People should have some moderate certainty about the rules. And so we should get rid of this restriction on trade, but people have made decisions under the rules you set. You should let them get out a little bit slowly, not just throw them on the heap overnight. So, so I don't know about that tariff stuff, but specifically off the top of my head, Ron, but there's a lot of distortion of Adam Smith, but we have definitive texts now. So people who want to quote Adam Smith should give you chapter and verse, then we can all go and have a look ourselves and see if it really is there, yeah?
Any other questions? Right here, and then at the back.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Tony. That's very interesting. I just have a query about your initial framing where you had the reference to the traditional view of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations emphasising prices and markets, and these are not not included in the introductory discussions, whereas you've emphasised other things like the progressive dynamics and development of capitalism. When I tend to read it, I tend to read all of those things together. That is, I don't see the first proposition as necessarily inconsistent with his emphasis on the dynamics of development, mainly because of his discussion of the extent of the market, the fact that that's prominent in the linking of the idea of the division of labour. So I'm just suggesting that maybe there's not such a difference between those perspectives that you're presenting.
I think this might be a little bit more fully dealt with in the Invisible Hand Revisited paper that I'll present this afternoon. And I will say there that the decentralised coordination of demand and supply via price flexibility and the competition with open capital markets and no barriers to entry or limited barriers to entry is important. But it's not some sacred icon important for its own sake. It's important by the way it contributes to the development of the economy. And what is the economy for? Adam Smith says it is to enable people to live better, not the rich. To enable a mass of people to live comfortably. Adam Smith is contemptuous of the luxury consumption of the rich. He talks about it. Google Adam Smith text for the word trinket or bauble. He thinks that they are childish. Their consumption is childish. Yeah? He's interested in extending material comfort to the bulk of the people. The price system's purpose is to serve that, right? So it's not about saying, this rather than that, but saying what is the architectonic of all this, right? So instead of this nonsense about, oh, look at the glory of the market, look what miracles it does spontaneously without any guiding hand, right? This is rubbish, right? What is important is about how the market mechanism serves the process of economic development and the material consumption of the bulk of people.
Question right at the back.
Thanks for that, Tony. I'm just wondering, what, if anything, do we know about Smith's view on the politics of the day, on the big events that were happening around him? Not so much from an economic perspective, but from a political perspective. Did he have sympathy with the 13 colonies? Does he do any? Is any of his writing reflective of, I guess, a broader political philosophy?
I'm not the one to ask because it's not really a focus of my interest, but you have the good fortune, I think, if a Q&A is feasible with Lisa via... Lisa Hill knows heaps about this stuff. You should store your question. I mean, I could ramble on for 3 minutes, but
Consider it stored.
yeah. Oh, by the way, and she specifically has an essay on Smith's advice about the colonies and what the British government should do. So she knows a lot about that.
Tony, Doug Hall, thanks very much for your presentation. My background's complex science, particularly biology, and when I came to economics and discovered Smith, he struck me, and you've touched on this I think in a number of parts, very much as somebody struggling with a complex system. And I think that has led to, so many different positions because he's struggling. But what I particularly like, and your comments about his comments on how to deal with the American economy, I think is critical because complex systems, time is critical. And so much in politics and some views of economics, time is almost non-existent, hence the revolutionary concept. So the fact that he's an evolutionist, to me, is inherent in his struggling with a complex system. So I just wondered if you had a similar view. But just one other thing, you touched on one of your last quotes about what I think is the input value theory of value, which of course was picked up by Ricardo and Marx and dominates left policy. And of course the marginal revolution in the 1870s had a different view, which is a subjective theory of value. And it seems that this tension between these two views of value are one of the prime drivers of politics in general. And you often see this in debates between representatives of the union movement and representatives of industry groups, and they're really just taking those two positions. So again, do you have a view on that difference of opinion, and how do we resolve it if it's resolvable at all? Thanks.
So on the first thing, perhaps rather than evolution's fine, I think that's a fair word, but I guess what I would say is Adam Smith always speaks in an historical voice. He always wants to talk the history of things to understand them. Yeah? So That's probably even evident enough from my few quotes, how much he frames everything in historical narrative terms. So yeah, I think dynamic, evolutionary, biological metaphor has value there, I think. On the theory of value, the objective theory of value and the subjective theory of value, as between classical economists and the marginalists from the late 19th century forward. You know, people get obsessed with the theory of prices on this issue, but it's really, the secret is the theory of distribution. If you want to understand why the theory of prices is so radically different in classical economics versus marginalism, the secret lies in the difference in the theory of distribution. So it's like, don't get distracted by price theory. Look at the role that the theory of distribution is playing. This is the only Band-Aid I could get at the Intercontinental. He apologised that he couldn't find a tan one. Yeah, don't get distracted by the price theory. Go to the theory of distribution. I'm with the classical economists on that. So distribution is a social and political thing. That is where the explanation for distribution lies. In marginalism, it becomes a private thing. It's in the psychology of the consumer, right? Is the key to the theory of prices. This is why political economy becomes economics. That's the deep reason why political economy becomes economics.
I think we had a question at the back, did we not? Right at the back and then on here, or two there. Yeah. And then we'll run over.
Perhaps following on from the gentleman over here, does Smith in his very last edition of The Wealth of Nations, is he influenced at all by the events in France, given his closeness to the French?
I can't remember the precise year of the last edition of The Wealth of Nations during his life, but if you're alluding to that marvellous quote about the man of system, that's from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. So that sixth edition is 1790, right? So people have speculated, as perhaps is implied by your question, is the man of system about the French Revolution? I think the timing is too tight. But there are plenty of men of system before Robespierre, right? I mean, maybe the man of system is Cromwell.
Thank you, Dave. We have two questions here. Do we have a... Thanks, Lisa.
Yes, hi.
Just wait.
Just one moment.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very interesting. So my question probably would be, you said that Adam Smith is a critic of the monopoly, and during his time, wealth is measured through commodity. So I was wondering, how do you describe his relationship with the government, given that it looks like he has a support with the aristocrat as well? So I was just thinking, how would you describe his probably affair with the government, knowing that he's also into acknowledging that the government has a responsibility when it comes to education and welfare of the people as well.
So when you say his relationship with government, you mean specifically with actual British governments of the time?
Yes.
Yeah, this I cannot help you with, I'm sorry. It's not a matter I've paid any attention to, with apologies. But again, you might try that on Lisa Hill. She's a politics professor, so she knows lots about this stuff.
Thank you.
Time for one more. Hi, you mentioned his moral sentiments and his idea that humans have, they're driven by self-interest and they're self-regarding, but they're also very sociable. Does he address, the tension between these two?
Well, I think the whole point the whole point of the theory of moral sentiments is to resolve this. Yeah. So the opening sentence of the very first sentence of the theory of moral sentiments, it starts like this: how selfish soever man may be, there are evidently some principles in his nature Now, I can't quote the rest verbatim, but it goes something like this. That directing to the well-being of others, though he gained nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it, right? So there's your point of departure, right? And it goes to the psychology of empathy, or the famous word he uses is sympathy, but probably empathy. In our use of words, sympathy is a bit too limp-wristed, I think. It's more empathy, I think, better captures what he has in mind than sympathy. But perhaps Michael McClure will be talking about these things later today as well. So it's a big thing, yeah, but how this gets reconciled in human psychology.
Thanks very much, Tony. I think we might have to draw it to a close for morning tea there. I had several wonderful questions to ask, but you've precluded me from doing so. So we've only got 15 minutes scheduled for morning tea, so make a dash for that porridge while it's warm, and we'll see you back here then. But before we go, let's thank Tony again for a brilliant introduction.